Hi, my name's Joe Cernik. I'm a member of the faculty here at Lindenwood University, and I'd like to welcome you to Insight. Now, Insight is the show where we normally discuss books on politics, both domestically and internationally, sometimes historical books that provide insight or perspective on the present, sometimes broader atmospheric or trend analysis books to put some political developments into a broader perspective. To some extent, I think this current book we're going to be talking about is addressing broader trends in international affairs. It's written by a man named Robert Cooper. He is a former British diplomat and a former foreign policy advisor to Tony Blair when Blair was Prime Minister of Great Britain. The title of his book is called The Breaking of Nations, Order and Chaos in the 21st Century. Now, joining me on the show today are three Lindenwood University students. To my immediate right is Jessie Basler. To Jessie's right is Tania Contreras, and to Tania's right is Jacob Bauer. So I wanted to read a quote from the book so we can get a sense of it, and then we'll jump into a discussion about it. The author writes, both the spread of terrorism and that of weapons of mass destruction point to a world in which Western governments are losing control. The spread of the technology of mass destruction represents potentially massive redistribution of power away from advanced industrial and democratic states towards smaller states that may be less stable and have less of a stake in an orderly world. Or more dramatically still, it may represent a redistribution of power away from the state itself and towards individuals, that is to say, terrorists or criminals. If proliferation were to take place in this fashion, it would not only be Western governments that would be losing control, but all those people who have an interest in an orderly world.
I agree. Throughout the book, Cooper discusses how the militant actions and the different technologies are vastly growing nuclear, and it's going to be an issue when that actual militant action breaks out, because in the past we've just had war on land, on water, with very little technology, and the main thing that is as that technology grew, the destruction became higher. So now that there's this threat of a nuclear war breakout, smaller countries have higher stakes in it because they have nothing to lose, but this technology could basically destroy the entire world order.
Yes. One of the most important concepts that you have to know when you go into international relations is the realism paradigm, which essentially means that most analysts who analyze other countries or other state factors will look at a rational actor as a decision maker for that state. And when you think about terrorist organizations being ruled by a single, maybe not so rational individual, the fear of a nuclear war or the usage of weapons of mass destruction becomes enormous, because we don't know exactly how these individuals will act in the end turn. So what we're seeing right now is that because we have these organizations that aren't necessarily states, but postmodern realists will analyze them sometimes in situations as being states, because they lack that rational actor, it's really almost impossible to know how these weapons will do in the hands of those individuals.
Yeah, and it really kind of highlights the dangers of terrorism, especially with the uncertainty of the future in nations like China and India and the roles they might hold in the future, especially with institutions like the EU.
Yeah. He was saying that he referred to a Japanese cult where they used anthrax in the subway system, and so that he said, okay, they didn't do a lot of damage, but at some point you're going to have an organization like this, and you have just a sufficient number of people, they could seriously kill thousands. And so as a result, if you're looking on that level and we're not looking on nuclear capable level, what can be done as far as that conflict between order and chaos?
I definitely think that going off of that terrorist attack, that failed ultimately of the Japanese cult, it could be replicated in the future because these smaller interest groups are capable of inflicting danger that only large groups would attempt in the past and things like that. But they have a capacity for this component of the subgroups to have this massive damage because they don't really have ties to a nation that's governed by these international affairs. And a normal country wouldn't attack someone because of the allyships that they have and the defense that it would cause on a global scale. These smaller groups can inflict this danger because they fly under the radar and they're not governed by these people.
And these smaller groups have also, in some ways, attained technology that they didn't have in the past. Whereas if you had a terrorist organization within the early 1800s, their most effective weapon was not a weapon of mass destruction. If anything, they were usually armed with what we would call handheld weapons, which would at most kill a few men before they would be taken down. But now when we see organizations that are getting hands on even potentially nuclear weapons, as we see in Pakistan, that fear becomes a lot greater because in the end you don't really need thousands of nukes to cause great damage. You really only need one.
And we just have to look at the events of 9/11 to prove his point that, you know, terrorism is an unconventional means to like threaten a state. So
He's using the year 1989 as sort of an important turning point year. So that's the end of the Cold War. And now we move on to something else. So then he was comparing it to three other dates. 1789 is the French Revolution, and 1815 is the end of the Napoleonic era, and 1919 is the end of the First World War. And so he was saying that this here was a significant date, and so now we move beyond the Cold War, and you're trying to make adjustments to what's coming next. And to some extent, he sort of says that you have a modern world and a postmodern world, and so then you sort of may be lumping, in a simplistic way, countries into these two categories and trying to see the conflict between them.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, the Cold War created this kind of balance of power due to the race for supremacy, and the balance was based on fear against those states, against their own autonomy from different supremacies across the board and things like that. And when you have this kind of fear, you create this network of stabilities, as the author explained, an equilibrium that these states are fearing each other, and so they're not going to attack each other, fearing the ramifications of an attack. And that's kind of what his basis of the book is, that we need to return to that kind of Cold War post state when everyone kind of stayed in their own areas, didn't affect each other, but they all had this kind of power balance that was an unspoken cue to others not to attack.
Which is actually a little bit conflicting with his previous essay, in which he talked about the difference between hegemony and essentially a balance of power, in which he states that the theory of balance of power, where you have multiple states neither becoming an empire but instead coexisting with each other, ironically actually leads to an increase of war because they're constantly fighting over limited resources within their geographical areas. And so what we're seeing right now with the move from modern countries over to postmodern countries, which tends to include Western Europe, these postmodern countries are not necessarily adjusting to the system that we want them to adjust to. I mean, if you want evidence of that, this book was written in 2003. I would have loved to see what the author would have to say about Britain leaving the European Union now, because that is clear evidence, at least to me, that social control within these states is not always 100% effective.
I was actually wondering the same thing, because he highlights how important the European Union is for the international integration, focus on like the citizens and the future. And with Britain leaving or planning to leave the EU, I'd kind of be interested to see what he has to say about that.
Yeah, I'm wondering that too. I mean, my guess is what he'll end up doing is talking about informal arrangements that won't maybe significantly alter the relationship between Britain and the continent of Europe. So, because he seems to be trying to address it as broader than just, say, the European Union. And so that's what it's more that he seems to be transcending that to address the idea that there's still a change in behavior of how these countries are getting along with each other.
I definitely agree. While he does say that the European Union is not going away, it's going to remain, kind of became something it wasn't meant to be, and now it's kind of a policing organization for these international affairs. And as Tania brought up, the postmodern era, people are more focused on self-realization rather than patriotism. And so to have that collective activity is kind of a dispute between the individuals of the country. And so they would rather rely on like the media and the attention and the opinions of smaller groups to make their decisions like they did in Brexit than overlying that overarching kind of control that the European Union has over them.
And we've seen multiple states now, especially Spain, essentially outcalling the EU for over-exercising its power, as we see the EU trying to intervene within Spain over the issue of Catalonia. We also see Spain continuously rejecting other desires of powers within the EU to accept other smaller countries into the EU, like Kosovo. And time again, they have stated their position that they won't allow these smaller states into the Union. And yet the Union still acts as if it has sovereignty over these areas in some instances where it truly, really doesn't have that authoritarian power.
And that kind of really reinforces his idea of the uncertainty of the postmodern world and like what's going to become of many of the like nations around the world.
Yeah, this notion is that he's seeing that conflict, that this postmodern world basically is one of greater order, and mainly he seems to be pointing to only Western Europe. Even though it's Europe, because you have the end of the Cold War, I get the feeling he seems to be talking more Western Europe than necessarily incorporating Eastern Europe. He doesn't precisely say so, but you get this feeling as you read the book, but that seems to be what he's sort of referring to.
Yeah, I definitely think that his scope is extremely limited to his own kind of areas, and I understand why he would do that. The main book is trying to explain how Europe and how Britain is going to be affected by this new postmodern world and things like that. But I think by ignoring the ramifications of international countries and their effects and how they interpret postmodern, he's leaving out a huge piece of the puzzle that's going to deal with international affairs, and especially like the global communities like the European Union and things like that, that I feel that he ignores their foreign policy and focuses on the domestic.
And you can actually see his bias within the Western European Union, or the Western area. Whenever he starts talking about modern versus postmodern countries, he essentially says that modern countries are democracies, and yet when he's describing modern countries, he completely leaves out two major non-democratic modern countries, which would be Russia and the Republic of China. And so what we're seeing here is that his perspective is definitely limited, but I think that in a sense it sort of has to be limited if he's putting an emphasis on the European Union, which he seems to mostly do.
He has a quote. It says, "What came to an end in Europe, but perhaps only in Europe, were the political systems of 3 centuries." And so this meaning 1989, with what he uses as the demarcation point with the end of the Cold War and then the emergence to something else. And so he's saying we would be seeing in Europe then sort of the emergence of what he says a single political system. And so he's seeing some developments. He says we now live in a divided world, but divided quite differently from the days of the East-West confrontation, which would be the Cold War. First, there is the pre-modern world, the pre-state, the post-imperial chaos, and then he goes on to sort of address. And so I think what he's sort of trying to do is that you can't insulate yourself in this sort of stability environment from what's going to be developing over here. And he's still saying it's still in stages of development.
Well, yeah, relative to the Cold War, a lot of countries were very isolated. They didn't rely on people as much as we would expect them to, but now in this postmodern world, we're a very interdependent, like, nation state. The state becomes less controlled as chaos kind of spreads, and chaos doesn't stay in one country. It spreads through borders for religion and your allies. So effective foreign policy would kind of expose that chaos, bring out the outlying countries into the field of their own to kind of overlay it into the global standard. But instead, in the postmodern world, it's frequently ignored, it's forcibly extinguished, and instead this collapse kind of leads to those power vacuums that we have that he doesn't really discuss, and I'm kind of upset that he didn't, because it relates to anarchy and crime and refugee crisis. So rather than ignoring these situations and letting natural order rehabilitate the nation, you have to focus on international groups that kind of intervene and apply their own domestic policy because it's a global network. We're no longer isolated.
And it brings up one of the biggest critique of the liberalist view from the realist perspective, that essentially when you try to over-globalize the world, when you try to interconnect all of these different states into one, when one goes to battle, it's not just the one state. For example, if Israel was in trouble right now, it's one of the United States' major ally. So the United States is also brought into the mix. And so it makes you wonder whether cooperation within these states is actually the more effective way of achieving peace, or if the realist perspective where each country acts within its own interest is a much better approach.
And that's kind of highlighted in his 5 maxims, where he talks about the importance of international relations and like how they should operate between nations.
Some of those maximums he's coming up with are sort of how you're seeing some countries their foreign policy is a reflection of their domestic politics. And so he, I guess, feels that wasn't always necessarily true, but has become more apparent among some of the post-industrial countries. And so then this is sort of one of the ways he seems to be distinguishing sort of post-industrial from what he's going to see emerging as sort of modern. He uses a term, it is the early days since the end of the Cold War, and more pre-modern states will emerge, so that we're not necessarily seeing everything that is still out there. So, and that's understandable. You have the end of something, and takes a while to sort of let all the pieces sort themselves out.
Yeah, I definitely agree with him on this point. There is an incessant need in modern times for foreign nations to kind of examine other countries' domestic affairs and try to impart their own advice and their own definitions on those countries regardless of a culture. It's a very Eurocentric notion of trying to assimilate everyone to one style. So forcing those domestic policies to oversee foreign ones, that's kind of the cause of international modernity. It's actually broken down distinctions between the two. As the United Nations or European Union kind of mandates, the domestic and foreign policies kind of merge together, causing kind of a strife between these different countries and internal issues that they kind of ignore just because they're trying to assimilate everyone to this global policy.
And it sort of goes both ways, where you talk about your local policies essentially influencing your international policies. International policies do have an effect on more local policies, but those local policies are deemed by the individual citizens within that state as being more important than the international relation policies. So what we're seeing is people who have maybe less power over a large country but instead have more municipal power over small counties can actually have a lot more influence over the people within those regions than international policymakers.
And we see, like, kind of with the end of the empires in Europe, with all the rise of nation states from their colonies, like, and that just gave the rise to all those pre-modern kind of nation states.
Yeah, his quote, when an empire breaks up, the question of identity becomes relevant for the first time. And so in this sense, he was referring to the breakup of the Soviet Union, so that then you're looking at different parts that are now all trying to have a sense of identity. And some of that, he says, is this is why religion emerges as a priority issue in these parts of the world, whereas it wasn't necessarily so before. So that he sometimes sees that religion can end up being a disruptive thing, because then it's not always allowing you to sort of work out some of your differences. You're going to develop more of these absolutism ways of sort of trying to see things.
Yeah. While on an individual scale, self-realization is kind of replacing nationalism and patriotism, most empires have always been categorized by their religious beliefs and definitions, and the attempt to assimilate others to their own religion affiliation kind of initiate multiple imperialistic motives, and that's kind of how the world kind of developed through imperialistic Europe and things like that, is that monarchs and the ruling class would borrow their power from the church and vice versa, and it's a dying theme in modernity, thank God, because those kind of chaotic movements actually stirred a lot of chaos in the border creations that caused a lot of that strife that we see in modern days. And so religion, as he views, kind of creates these divisions and these biases that aren't really welcome in a global scale now.
And I mean, if you want an example of how this argument holds up outside of the European nations, you can look at the example of the separation between India and Pakistan, where you essentially had a large portion of the population that was Islam, and so they created their own state as opposed to living within the same area as those who had opposing religious views.
one of the things he talks about, he says there are many countries that could become too powerful or too aggressive for regional balance, and then he pointed to China and India. So again, outside of the, let's call it post-industrial or postmodern era, into where problems may still alive, and that you're then trying to realize that you're not going to be able to contain some of this potential conflict. It will spill over. And that, I think, is one of also his maxims, is the notion that things are never contained. They can spread so that you create problems that way.
I agree. Both China and India hold the traits of modern empires. They have loyalty, uniformity, and the religious unity as the main character. So both are advanced in technology, so they could overcome their own regional borders regardless of their size. So with these massive populations and economies, they have the capability to grow and become very dominant on a global scale. And so new imperialism kind of awakens that trend of old imperialism, but there's a guide under economic expansions rather than assimilation on a global scale.
And I mean, we see the potential threat of China within the within the Asian nations. As we talked about it last week within the book of Asia's Cauldron, we see that if China were to ever take complete power of the South China Sea, they would definitely have dominating power over the rest of the states that simply don't have the economic, political, or military stability to stand up to them.
In both India and China, they have the two largest populations in the world, and they're not bound to an institution like the European Union. So that kind of leaves up the question, like, what does their role become in the world?
Yeah, he's trying to say it's not quite the same, because when he's looking at Europe, again, the merging of domestic and foreign, and again, this is pre-Europe, Britain pulling out of the European Union, so you're trying to figure out exactly what's going to happen. But my feeling is that they're going to follow some of the norms and behavior patterns as though they might still be within it, because it's still part of their economic and interrelationship. And so he goes on and spends several pages about this European integration of domestic and foreign, and you can't see where one is beginning and the other ending, and they blur together, and as a result, this creates this degree of stability, which we're not necessarily going to see in other parts of the world.
Yeah, the codependence of a lot of European countries through travel, through economics, through trade and things like that kind of creates this network of balance. No one wants to step out of line because it'll throw the whole balance off, but sooner or later I feel that there will be a country that wants to rise over everyone. That's the kind of theory that we saw with Brexit, is that there is dissimilation. We see this kind of symbiotic relationship, but there's always the threat that it's going to change very rapidly, and there's really no consistency that it's going to stay the way it is just because we want it to stay that way.
And again, we're seeing this move away from hegemony towards social order. And like he said before, the move towards social order is essentially always going to be disastrous, especially when you guys lack a coherent identity. While we might say that Western Europe has a more coherent identity now than it did 100 years ago, while Britain and France certainly don't have the same rivalry that they did way back during the time of the Revolution, they still are completely separate entities. A Frenchman is still completely different from an Englishman. And so until those identities can become either one, or until they can overcome the differences that exist within all of these different cultures within the region, you're still going to see a lot of issues rising up.
And he says, that they kind of like rely on each other and like cooperate, but then he kind of points out that they also rely on the United States. And while he criticizes the role of the United States and its military power, he does point out, though, that the European Union relies on America as like the security force of the world.
He sees Japan moving towards postmodern, so similar and characteristic to what you're seeing in Europe. But then with Russia, he says Russia poses an important problem. Is it going to be pre-modern, modern, or postmodern? It embodies all three possibilities. So then again, where he's pointing to potential problems that may emerge. And so, you're looking at, well, okay, where are we going from here?
He's kind of like said that, he believes that Russia kind of has given up on its like expansion and influence around the world. But I mean, in the last 2 years, we've seen with our own election that, I don't think Russia has given up on that influence. It's kind of just changed its tactics on how it influences other countries, especially in Europe.
one of his quotes, "The image of domestic order and international anarchy is a false one on one level. The world is in fact this highly structured and orderly system. On the other hand, anarchy remains the underlying reality in the security field for most parts of the world." And so once again, you're having some sorts of problems. He refers to nuclear proliferation, but doesn't really, I think, go into technical detail about what will happen, just sort of feels that some weapons will probably be made available at times to very unstable states, and with going to unstable states, and there'll be different groups and individuals within those states that will have access to them.
Yeah, as military develops and these technologies kind of increase, nuclear is the future. It's currently being developed, and it's the threat of nuclear weapons that have caused so much intervention, especially on America's part. But the issue behind that is that if a nuclear weapon was to be detonated and cause that nuclear fallout, that would be a global scale issue. The anarchy would arise, that terrorism would bring on that chaos that we would assume would happen. And he hints at that, but you can never say when it's going to happen or if it's going to happen. That's the reason a lot of these countries are developing nuclear weapons, is simply for the threat of, if you have one, then I'm going to have one as well. And it's kind of that balance of power that creates this stable kind of world that we live in, but it's always a threat of dissimulation.
We only have a few minutes left, so what do you think of the book, and do you recommend it to viewers?
Personally, I felt that he did cover a lot of information in a very short book. I think he has an extreme bias in his writing and things like that I personally don't agree with, but if you share his scope and his lens of the global scale, I think it is an effective book to read. It does cover a lot of things, but I feel that overall he contradicts himself in a lot of different points, and it's a very difficult book to follow.
It's definitely more from a realist and a conservative perspective, but I think it's definitely a good read for anybody who is interested in finding out about the intricacies of how states work within each other in the current time. And I think it would be interesting to see how a lot of his theories and a lot of his arguments within the book transcend into the new year. Again, this was written in 2003, so the thoughts of North Korea acquiring a nuclear weapon was still new back then. So it's interesting to apply the things that he says in the book to the current time.
Yeah, and like Jessie said, I mean, it's a short book, but it can be a challenging read, especially trying to kind of decipher like his train of thought. So
he talks about the United States as being a hegemony, so hegemonic as opposed to sort of a dominant power, but that he sort of says it's unusual that countries are willing to easily accept it, and that the United States then plays this major role in foreign affairs. But the book is written pre-Donald Trump, so you're sort of wondering, well, how might his views begin to change because of that? And so then again, you're trying to see some degree of evolution with what goes on in the world around us, and how will other countries now respond if they actually feel this is a long-term trend, or whether after the Trump presidency we'll see the United States try to, again, say, no, we're on top of the heap, and how you're looking at this. So these little developments sort of go along. Overall, I thought it was a good book. It provides sort of a quick way of looking at international developments, and in that sense, I think may be a good book for people to read. Thank you for joining us today.